Hello and welcome to this video on making the most of mixing in modular with lots of patch tips, while also demoing the new Hive, a stereo Eurorack mixer from Vostok Instruments. Here's what's to come. This video is sponsored by Vostok Instruments. So like most of my demos, my goal here is to make a technique and patch tip filled video with ideas you can take away and apply to many things. In this case, mixing in a Eurorack modular format. And this is also a demo that throughout shows and uses Hive, this new mixer module from Vostok Instruments. There's things in the video like creating a layered approach to synth lines, patterns and effects, reinforcing thick low-end rhythms in techno, making hi-hats more dynamic and exciting, using panning as a VCA, panning as an effect send router, stereo wave shaping, and making audio rate modulation musical. So getting into Hive, this is a 10 HP 4-channel stereo mixer with a few nice quirks on top of the basics. Each of the 4 channels offers 9 dB of potential gain boost, making it easier to balance the levels of your different modules, and there's enough gain there to integrate pro line level gear into your mix too. There's panning and stereo balance with a custom pan law slope to ensure a smooth curve with manual panning or from the CV inputs that control the panning. Those pan CV-ins can go right through audio rates too, turning it into a great sounding stereo wave shaper, and we'll patch that later in the video. There's a high quality, high headroom, clean AC coupled audio path. AC coupling means there's DC filtering which blocks sub-audio signals, so it's worth noting this isn't a mixer for modulation CV. And as usual from Vostok, the manual nicely demonstrates and explains not just the controls of the module, but the concepts involved too. The channels are mono in going into the left or stereo, and there's a stereo out with master level control, and LEDs here that don't show clipping. It's hard to clip this with the high headroom that it has, but that shows you when there's a level of around 17 volts peak to peak, so it's more of a visual indication that your levels are getting quite loud, and just to be aware of them and adjust if necessary. You can chain multiple Hive modules together with the included 6-pin ribbon cable, and you go from the chain out on your first Hive module to the chain in on the next, and that pulls that through to them all being mixed together should you need more channels. And while Hive is released today, Vostok Instruments modules are now available in VCV Rack, including my collaboration modules Trace and Path. I've had a lot of fun in VCV Rack with these modules, and I'll share a patch from VCV later in the video too. So let's get stuck into making some modular mixes, submixes, and just loads of patch tips in general. I think mixers, like VCAs, are something you can often not have enough of, so I think it's of great benefit to explore them. Timing index to click and skip around the patches is on screen and down below in the description, so without further ado, let's dive in. So this is my first patch with Hive, and one of the first things that I also thought to do when I first learnt about Hive. And that is to bring this very kind of layered approach to making modular synth lines that I like to use, bringing that together in a mix. It's got stereo width, I think it's got good 3D depth, some effects throws. And just take a listen for a moment before we strip it back. Next Tuesday, an eloquent set of sequencing here. The oscillators are Senna, and it's a saw wave coming into a low pass filter on Atlas. That is our main dry channel on channel 1 of Hive here. Now opening the filter, You can hear there's mixed up modulation going on, there's envelopes from Fuji, there's some sequencing from my pattern generators, and some audio rate modulation from the sine oscillator on Sena. That's then going through a passive low pass gate just struck with 16th notes, and that's just the dry sound. Channel 2 is the square oscillator out of Sena, just playing a quarter note pulse, straight into a passive low pass gate here, just ticking away with an LFO to its pan. So I get this nice quarter note stereo accent kind of waving around. And this is exactly the kind of thing I like to do when working with modular voices, to build out layers from existing modules that are in the signal path, creating this depth, space and kind of dynamic patching. I then get into my effects here, and I'm using a split cable up into path, and that's routing under modulation. I remove the modulation and route to the crush delay here, which has been high passed, but that's kind of effects send 1 if you like to the delay. And then out of channel 4 here on path is the reverb from the oximeter. So if I turn up just the delay and modulate path as I was, you can hear we're throwing into this delay. And similarly, if I turn up the reverb on channel 4 here, so together, panning delay, stereo reverb, and I can build out this modular voice. Dry on channel 1 again, quarter note accent that's panning on channel 2, delay throw, and finally the reverb. So while this might just sound like a kick and hi-hat heavy techno example, there's a lot going on. There's some modulation, a lot of kind of depth and submixing. So let's run down this example of why you might just need a load of mixing and why it's handy to have that as an option in your system. So starting with this top Hive module here, this is very much the kind of broad picture output mixer, and I have a kick here from Bohm. And then the second channel is a whole modulated submix from this Hive that I'll take a look at in a moment. Channel 3 is the clipping modulated shaped triangle here from Sena from Vostok Instruments through a low pass gate. And it's just a simple offbeat, but it's really adding to that low end of the kick. If I remove it, we can hear this driven tail from Bohm's really complex kick, kind of swelling into the offbeat, and just by patching and adding a little bit of reinforcement to that, I'll leave this quite loud, and then just sink it underneath the kick. I feel like with lots of low end energy, really rhythmic and energetic. Then the fourth channel is some scattered, PT delayed and granular processed cymbal sounds. As I pull the input, it tails off really nicely in the mix. So I'm almost going to pull that cable like a mute or a send to and from that process. Now looking at the submix here, my first channel is the Ultra Perk. Almost like a low tom, thumpy, kicky snare thing. But it's this red modulation here where the blue line is 0 volts, and I'm modulating above and below that with positive and negative voltages to pan that sound around. The main hits are right down the center, but hopefully if you've got some headphones on or you can hear it through your speakers, you can hear this hard left and right kind of pinging around. And it's the dynamics of those extra little bits of stereo movement with that modulated pan that I think work really well in this context. And channel 2 here is a reversed ride sample that's been sidechained in Manic here. And then a nice tip for your 16th note hi-hats. I have one consistent 16th note clocked hi-hat just running all the way through here. And then the mix out of all these samples, I'm also playing 2 more samples, and I'm using the div skip here to probability skip between which ones get triggered. So the clock comes into div skip, and I can trigger this sample, or this one, or let the probability coin toss between the two. And they add on top of, just muting it there, this steady one. So the steady one plays, and it just adds some movement, some dancing, some life. And then there's some attenuated stepped random that's playing on every 16th note too, into the pan. It's not particularly drastic, it's quite attenuated. It's just that little bit of movement that just plays into things really nicely. And then a good old faithful 909 style open hi-hat. And all of that submix is coming through meta here for some filtering, low pass, or high pass. So kick, bass. Let's get some effects happening again. And we'll bring in the submix. So while we think of panning as moving to the left or right speaker or headphone in a stereo mix, it's really just a routing mechanism to send something to one place or another. What that is totally up to you. And in this case, I'm using the right output as a mono out and panning to it like a VCA. The left output isn't going anywhere, so I'm going from nothing to panning 2 more output on the right, like raising the level on a standard VCA. Now turning down these channels, and turning off some delay that I have. Different oscillators from the Vostok Center are coming in here. The first one, a folded sine. And let's remove all the modulation too. And you can hear it's just playing a sequence here. I could change the folding. But panning to the right increases its level. Panning to the left decreases it. So if I take this yellow trace here, which is the orange cable, and pan that channel with the envelope, very much works like a standard VCA. On channel 3 here, again panning to the right, I have a higher pitched triangle playing a less dense rhythmically envelope here. That's the red trace, so I'll use that to pan. And finally, channel 2 is a square wave, or rather a slightly thinner pulse, again tuned higher. And using this envelope to control its pan. Very infrequent, then more frequent but not the full rhythm. And then the most dense rhythm here, the main sequence. Effects back in, just because I like the sound. So that's using envelopes to panning from left, which is nothing, to right, like a VCA. So if you're stuck and you need some VCAs, and you happen to have a stereo mixer around with voltage control panning, you can use it like a VCA. So here's a really simple technique, just that panning is effectively just a routing mechanism. In most cases, routing to the left or right outputs for the stereo image in speakers or headphones. But your left output could just be kind of effects chain 1, your right output could be effects chain 2, and then any modulation or manual movement of pan is just routing through different signal paths. So removing my actual effects chains in this Hive mixer, which is the output section of the case here, we'll focus on just the first input, which is simply a saw wave. And the splits here, these stackable cables, are just the dry outputs. These aren't processed. So as I pan, you can hear that pan, the saw wave there from center. And that's effectively all that panning's doing. It moves the sound from left to right as we think of anytime we think of a pan. But my first signal chain here, which comes off of the left output, I'm panned hard left here, is the green trace cable, coming into two filters, a high pass and low pass in series with each other, one through the other, and then that comes out into some reverb. Removing the verb, green trace here modulates my low pass, it's some audio rate modulation. An envelope, some random, some LFO. And then some step random is moving the high pass. We get this lovely croaky dual filter sound. That then hits the reverb and goes into my output mixing section. And the other signal path, as I pan to the right, just sends our simple saw wave input here out of the right output. That goes into a low pass gate, which has been struck rhythmically. That then comes into both filters here, two bandpass filters, and these are panned hard left and right before going into beads. If I remove the effects on beads, it's these two LFOs here, independently modulating these bandpass filters across their full range, before some reverb and granular processing from beads. And on channel 2, I have some noise. And it's nice to be able to move that either to the opposite effects chain or blend it in with that saw wave. That's the left chain, and then the right chain. And these would modulate really nicely, but I'm just going to manually move these as I play around. So as I mentioned in the intro, Vostok Instruments modules are now available in VCV Rack. And their multi-channel design offers a lot of functionality in not much screen space. HP is obviously not limited in VCV Rack, but it's nice not to scroll around a much larger patch than might be needed having multi-channels in most of these Vostok modules. So I have a central row of kind of sequencing here, but coming up to the top sequencer and top row, we have some drums with an oscillating filter kick, some pinged filter and noise shaping for the snare, and then trace scanning around different noise colours for some nice panned hi-hats there, panning in Hive, and some additional noise to reinforce the rhythms. The middle row is then the main voice. Saw wave into low pass filter is my main kind of channel here. And then I have a sub-octave square wave from center with a different rhythm, panning around, accenting, and this plays into this nice kind of layered approach to synth voices that I really enjoy in modular. We're then taking that sound into path and morphing through routing it to 4 different delays and patching those into another Hive mixer to create a stereo image of 4 delays. And that goes into clouds for a little bit of extra kind of octave, grainy shimmer and reverb. And then right at the bottom I have another center module creating chords like a chord oscillator that's filtered and sidechained a little bit in the series VCA. and that comes into that effects mixer too. And I tried to just use kind of VCV modules rather than going through the library and installing different things. So there's some quirks here, like using 3 sequential switches to make a clock divider. It's quite an involved patch. And if you'd like to play around with it, I'll upload that to Patreon. That's patreon.com/DivKid. You can download it there and play around, and we can discuss it further in the DivKid Discord. So let's take a look at audio rate panning, and we'll start just really basic before we make this more musical and dynamic with a larger patch. My input to channel 1 here is a triangle wave, and then from a second oscillator I have a higher pitched sine wave. I'm going to turn up the amount of this sine wave on an external attenuator, and that's going to then modulate pan there for that channel. And even with just a little bit of this pan modulation from this higher audio rate sine wave, you can see in here we start to get these really rich, lovely overtones. And because these are totally in sync, the modulating oscillator and the input, we get this slight beating and shifting, and that Lissajous white line there shows us that change in stereo image. Let's tune higher with this sine wave audio rate pan modulation. And you can hear that you quite easily hear the beating and kind of dissonance. And then you hear a nice interval. And unlike, say, FM synthesis, you don't lose that fundamental tuning of our input triangle here. Again, let's tune the modulator higher. And as I move the attenuation, the level of this signal coming into the pan, you might start to think actually modulating this with a VCA is going to give a really lovely effect, which it will, so that's what we'll do next. So here we have what I think is a musical, expressive and dynamic use of audio rate modulation, and in this case, audio rate panning. Now, going through what's happening without the panning, the black cables here is the square wave from Sena that has PWM from an LFO, and it's the combination of this green trace, envelope and cables, blue trace and cables, stepped random, that's been mixed together into modulating a low-pass filter. Turning that down, I have a whole kind of already articulated patch that is my modulation, and that's the white cables here. It's the saw wave oscillator from Sena into a VCA, where it has an envelope. It's the red trace and cables here. Turning that up full. That then comes into a low pass filter, and it's the yellow trace and cables modulating the cutoff. So if I just leave that fully open, this is kind of the equivalent of the saw wave just coming straight into the mixer here. And let's modulate the pan of the first channel with it. Really lovely, wide, kind of wave-shaped sound. But again, making this not just drone all the time, so turning it down in a VCA and using this envelope here, this is going to inject this modulation just on the steps that we're opening the VCA. So again, let's turn that down, turn up our main patch, and modulate the pan. And then finally, if I then turn down the filter, we've got level shifts and tone shifts, and all of this is now modulating that top channel. So that's making audio rate modulation musical, dynamic and expressive. This works really well modulating the level of something in a VCA, not just of panning. It's really nice with panning because it blooms out that image at audio rates each time that comes in. So here's a quick example just to show integrating line level instruments. There's enough gain here on Hive to actually integrate line level, and while it's not a specific interface, it's working here with this example. I have the digitone from Electron, master volume is up full, and I'm just using adapters here, as you can hopefully see, and normal patch cables into channel 1, gain up full, and that's playing against this droning PWM oscillator filter combo, being granularized and affected in beads just as this constant evolving drone. So that's really all there is to show. Plug in your line level device, you probably need to crank it up full and then turn Hive up full, but there's headroom in here and gain to actually integrate line level. Now play around briefly before we move on. Here's a quick patch just to mention, as I did in the intro, that you can chain Hive modules together. Here's a picture showing how you have chain in and chain out on the back of the modules. So patching chain out of this one across to chain in on this one, everything on this mixer appears at the right hand output, these two cables, which is what I'm recording. If I patch into these, it cuts the normal that is the chaining. So with this left hand Hive module playing, if you were to patch into it, you'd cut that chain and they'd function entirely like two independent mixers. And it's handy to chain things in, as sometimes you just need more channels. So here we're using the stereo mixer to create a more interesting stereo image to go into a stereo filter. So it's not just the stereo filter in a otherwise typical kind of analog subtractive patch, it's giving us interesting stereo movement. Now if I reduce this down to just a saw wave in the mixer here, this Hive mixer feeds both filters, and these are being modulated with interesting stereo modulation. Different LFOs per side, different amounts of inverted stepped modulation, and hopefully you're getting that impression. You can hear that although this is just now a saw wave, mono saw wave into both filters, there's interesting motion on the filter. To stop in the sequence, let's just open these filters fully. So saw wave on channel 1, higher tuned PWM oscillator from center on 2, wave folded sine with an LFO to the folding, and noise. We'll start with channel 2 on a modulated pan with an LFO. Have another LFO for channel 3, that folded sine. And the noise on channel 4 has pan modulation as well. So we'll go static down the middle with the saw wave as that kind of base state of the mix. PWM, you can see in here, is tilting to the sides of the LFO. Folded sine that's also moving around with a different LFO, and noise. And it's a lot of movement. That might sound like too much movement for just a blend of oscillator waveforms here. But once we start animating that in the filters, and I'll start my sequence playing, envelopes going into the filters. So I feel like the takeaway here is really to use stereo mixers, not just mono mixers, to feed stereo filters. Feed the different filters, different blends. If you can modulate, pan, modulate before the filter, then you can further enhance your stereo synth patches. How to make a mixer clip that doesn't want to clip. In this really clean, high headroom design that Hive is, but we can clip it, and here's how you do it. One simple technique. This is the input into channel 1, channel 1's up full. So there's some gain, but we're not going to clip this with just a Euro level beat. So by using this pink stackable cable, this takes a copy into the second channel, and we can kind of double the level if you like by turning that up full. And we're starting to clip, most obvious around the kick drum. And you could keep doing this, splitting copies into all 4 channels and adding more level, and ultimately get to clipping when you get enough level. But if we employ some kind of no input mixing techniques, which is to create feedback loops, other than just screaming madness, we can also get some really nice saturation. This is the right output. We're monitoring the left out here in mono. If you didn't have a stereo output, you could simply take a copy, again with a split cable or a mult, back into another spare channel. So right out into channel 3 here, also split into channel 4 for double feedback if you like. And turning up channel 3, we start to get some really interesting saturation. It will just oscillate at some point. But there's quite a lot of variation. Dialing in, clipping, again by splitting an input to 2 channels and feeding back also into 2 channels in this case. So there's how to make a mixer clip that won't. If you've got this far in the video, drop a mix sync in the comments. I hope you found the video useful and have a few things to take away and try for yourself. Grab the VCV modules to try them out, get mixing, and head to patreon.com/DivKid to support and gain access to exclusives, including the Discord community. I'll see you next time. Bye!